On 16 March 1935, the introduction of universal conscription and labour was announced. The Reichswehr was now called the Wehrmacht, thus Hitler's Germany, which had already withdrawn from the League of Nations on 14 October 1933, openly violated the ruling of the Versailles Peace Treaty on the limitation of armaments. Now all kinds of disguises, by means of which the fact was concealed that already in an army of 100,000, the preconditions for the rapid construction of a future army of 1 million were laid down, were no longer necessary. The victorious powers of 1918 made no effective response. 3 months later, Britain concluded a naval agreement with Hitler that authorized Germany to further arm at sea within the established balance of power. Nor did anything happen when, on 7 March 1936, Wehrmacht formations suddenly entered the Rhine demilitarized zone. I saw in newsreels how the regiments decorated with flowers marched across the Rhine bridges and through the streets of Cologne, proud of our Wehrmacht and envious of the comrades directly involved. After the introduction of universal conscription, more and more towns were turned into military garrisons. This meant that many of us would be transferred to another unit and most of us promoted. What training we had received in the Reichswehr we were now passing on to the conscripts. We were tortured to make us accustomed to unquestioning obedience. We endured all this because we were volunteers and agreed unconditionally to this training. This was not the case with the conscripts, but they were treated in the same way. In addition, some of us were not able to cope with the rapid promotion. Given unexpectedly great power, even as a small squad leader, they lost their heads and made gross errors in the choice of educational measures and training methods. Petty nagging and humiliating treatment, such as had not been seen in the Reichswehr, became commonplace. All this had a depressing effect on many conscripts. Such torturous torture had nothing to do with the necessary education for hardening. Meanwhile, many officers tacitly tolerated and some even encouraged it, which seemed strange and incomprehensible to me with my views and illusions at the time. After all, in my state the military service of a free man according to the ancient Germanic model was extolled as the noblest right of a citizen, and unfitness for military service was considered the greatest disgrace. Apparently, someone in high authority had arbitrarily set deadlines for the deployment of the army. When they were met, there was no time for reflection. Everything went according to schedule, and soldiers were produced according to the plan and on a conveyor belt. The head served to wear a helmet. The ultimate goal was to create a soulless steel machine of Nazi design. But amazingly, as a result of such army grinding, the soldiers functioned mindlessly thereafter. I was still a member of the 14th Anti-Tank Company in Kolberg. Over formation training, classes and gunnery studies passed day after day in all its service monotony. I was therefore naturally delighted at the variety that the assignment to Deberitz-Elsgrund for a 2-month driving instructor course brought into my life. As Ruth was no longer within reach, it was not so much the proximity of Berlin that attracted me as the new challenge. I became more and more immersed in reading textbooks and only travelled to my parents' house on Sundays. One day during the trip I met one of the shoemaker's sons. He was wearing a military uniform. "Mate, how are you doing? Where are you now?" "In Podger, in the sapper units." "What are your brothers doing?" "One's at the engine factory in Mariendorf. One works for Siemens and one's in the infantry in Potsdam. He's lucky to be home almost every Sunday." "Now, how are your parents?" "Thank you, my mother is doing well. The old man is incorrigible, but so is Erwin, the one who works for Siemens. When they talk, we have to close the windows. I can tell you about it, you know the old man. I'm afraid they'll put him in jail again if he doesn't calm down. When our troops entered the Rhineland, he thought there'd be a war. Whenever anything happens, he claims Hitler is leading the way to war." "And you like everything now? I mean, not just the service, but everything." "Hey, that, my dear, is how they find out what mood people are in. You're asking because I used to think differently. That's gone. Those were different times. Father's got so much work now that he's been able to take on apprentices, and he swears why none of us have learnt the shoemaking trade. But it is impossible to persuade him to give up his ideas. Hitler is leading the cause to war, he insists. And that's good enough, he'll break his neck on that again. I was unable to understand the cobbler. Well, I thought, because old trees can't be grafted, and he's too old. The answer seemed logical. The new views and social position of the old cobbler's son seemed to serve as a practical confirmation of my views. Another time I met my old Latin teacher. He condescended to have a mug of beer with me and immediately turned to his favourite topic. I tell you, we'll get everything back, everything, all the territories and colonies that were taken from us. Unrighteous deeds do not lead to good. Read the book A Nation Without Space, then it will become clear to you. And if they don't give it back to us voluntarily, we'll pound the table, my good man. And if need be, we veterans of 1914-1918 will have our words on the post. The retired reserve lieutenant and station commandant was so belligerent that I even forgot to ask about his daughter's health. I was pleased that he had finally let me go. Besides, I had plans of my own. I took the next tram to the radio tower, to the big car exhibition. At the end of the driver's instructor course, I had been granted, at my request, an extraordinary leave of absence for 3 days for a thorough inspection of the exhibition. The leave certificate was sent to me by post. When I finally arrived in Coburg again, my mate was waiting for me at the railway station. Smiling broadly, he shouted, "The shackles are already rattling. 3 days of leaps are assured for you." How come? What have I done? You were 1 day late from your holiday. That's enough. Indeed, I was released only for 2 days, but I looked inattentively at the leave certificate. The non-commissioned officer's corps was assembled, and the chief proclaimed, "Non-commissioned officer Windsor has completed the driver instructor course of all 3 classes with distinction. For this, he has been granted an extraordinary leave of absence for 2 days, and I commend him." After shaking my hand, he continued, "Non-commissioned officer Windsor has exceeded his leave by 1 day. For this, I punish him with arrest for 3 days. Dismissed." If a non-commissioned officer was to be punished, it was the duty of the field officer to take him to the brig and hand him over there. I was accompanied by an old acquaintance. I was to serve my punishment from 13 o'clock, but he came for me as early as 9 o'clock. It did not take more than a quarter of an hour to reach the old Philip beer house. I protested. "Why should we drink now?" "You'll have to do 3 days. It's not much. It can be done sitting on one half. I know from experience, I've been there. But it's a lot easier to serve time if you've had a good fueling up beforehand. That's the old-fashioned way." So we began to consume our morning beer, and we were almost late. At precisely 13 o'clock, the officer on duty opened the cell, and before that my braces were taken away from me to protect me from trying to use them for the wrong purpose and not in a soldierly way to end my life. Just a common gesture. Although German citizens were excluded by the thousands from the national community and deprived of their rights on the basis of discrimination laws in Hitler's Germany, Hitler's Germany nevertheless willingly played host to the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, in which athletes from 51 countries and people of all colours, skull shapes and other racial characteristics took part. My brother in the Ministry of Propaganda provided me with a ticket to this spectacle, and I was given a leave of absence from my company. Berlin was a sea of swastika banners. We Wehrmacht soldiers, police, stormtroopers, and SS men formed a cordon, assisted, and served as guides for the visitors. In the Olympic stadiums of the German capital, the best athletes met in difficult competitions, and the winners were unanimously greeted by a jubilant crowd. Delighted cheers also fell upon the underdogs. The Negroes Owens, Metcalfe, Robinson, Woodruff, and Johnson, who won for the United States 6 gold and 2 silver medals, and, in addition, together with 2 white athletes, a gold medal in the 400-meter race. However, with 33 gold medals, 26 silver medals, and 30 bronze medals, Germany was ahead of the United States. Nazi ideologues interpreted this victory of German athletes as a sign of the decisive advantage of a young German blood. I gave little thought to this aspect of the matter and was more pleased that the victory enhanced Germany's standing in the world. There was every reason to properly celebrate the Olympic victory. After a long search, I finally found myself seated at a table in the Vaterland restaurant on Potsdamer Platz, where a group of French tourists, old and young athletes from Alsace and Paris, were seated. The Alsatians spoke fluent German. I spoke a little French, and over a brandy there was no need for an interpreter at all. So mutual understanding was established. We once again discussed the course of the last Olympic Games. The French knew their history better than I did. Already in 1912 they were supposed to be held in Berlin, but the Kaiser's Germany, inexplicably why, refused it. The Games were held in Stockholm. 4 years later, young people were shedding blood on the battlefields. Fighting on the Olympic field was impossible. In 1920 in Antwerp and in 1924 in Paris, Germany was absent. She was allowed to compete again in 1928 in Amsterdam and in 1932 in Los Angeles. And now she has won the majority of the medals, and we have given our thoughts on the reasons for this success. Yes, since 1933, we've been very active in sports. I couldn't say anything else. And you, monsieur, do you play sports? Oh, yes, of course, every day. I showed the French my sports badges and explained to them the essential conditions to earn them. They were very interested. Where do you study, monsieur? I don't study, gentlemen. I'm a soldier. Oh, my God. Another soldier. We've seen so many men in uniform, and now the plainclothes men are soldiers, said the Parisian. I laughed. Don't you have soldiers in France? Of course we do, but not in such large numbers. We've changed a lot since the World War. We want to live well, that's all. We want to work, but not half to death. What do you call it in Germany? Oh yes, early retirement. Do you understand me? And you don't have to have too many children, they're expensive. 2 children in a family is enough. Live in peace and don't play soldiers anymore. There are more pleasant things, monsieur. The way he looked at me. I made him feel sorry for me. He probably thought I had been forced to become a soldier, and No. Tell me, please, are you and the other Germans satisfied with your life now? We have many émigrés in Paris, and you can hear a lot of things from them, but things look different here. What is the truth? The question was posed directly. How was I supposed to answer it? After all, I was personally satisfied, and it seemed to me that the majority of the population was also satisfied. The choice made by Ruth and the views of the shoemaker I regarded as an isolated phenomenon which could not affect the general judgment. Therefore, I did not mention it, nor did I mention Eva Gross, although I sincerely regretted that Jewish families I knew were suffering from discriminatory legislation. I still believed then that the application of the laws in practice would become fairer, after that unpleasant circumstance. After the introduction of universal conscription, there were again cases of conscientious objection, and this created difficulties. But I could not be expected to talk about it in such company. I gave the kind of answer that almost all foreigners get these days. We are past the bad times, and now we are on the rise. We earn good money, we can buy anything we want, we are happy. Ask anyone you want, everyone will tell you that. Don't you think, monsieur, that Hitler will start a war? Absolutely not, gentlemen. And why should he? We have other things to do. Hitler was a simple soldier himself. He knows what war is. War? No. They looked at each other as if they wanted to say, "You should drink honey with your mouth, my dear, but you've convinced us far from it." They didn't say that, but one of them asked, "Do you think it is right that Hitler is sending soldiers and arms to Spain?" That's quite a different matter, gentlemen. It's a fight against the Bolsheviks. Excuse me, monsieur, but what you say is not quite right. Spain is a democracy now, and Franco is fighting against it. If the Reichswehr, or whatever it's called now, well, yes, if the Wehrmacht acts there, that's interference in the internal affairs of another state. But General Franco asked for help. Who is General Franco, monsieur? The real government is in Madrid. Franco is a Spanish general who mutinied against his government. CK, monsieur? Did you know that the IOC met in Barcelona in 1931 and decided to hold the 1936 Games in Berlin? No. All right, it's not that important. But you know that Spain was going to participate in the Games here in Berlin and send 100 or 90 athletes. These are the men Franco is fighting against, and your Wehrmacht is helping him. Is that right, monsieur? Maybe he's right. Maybe it's not all right. So Franco wanted to destroy democracy. But if Spanish democracy was anything like what we had under the Weimar Republic, then let him do his thing. God willing, the Spanish should be grateful. At any rate, we have had enough of democracy. Much obliged. But I prefer to refrain from answering. A young Frenchman at the table had already begun to grumble. No more talk of politics, it would lead nowhere. They intended to go sightseeing. The girls' outfits in Paris are much more colourful and attractive. Ooh la la! There are beautiful girls there. And here too? No, German women are also very beautiful, but in a different way. A votre santé, monsieur. Prosit, gentlemen. French cognac is better, of course. Real cognac wine is cheaper and not so tart. But German beer. Yes, it goes to the head and then to the feet. But the old Frenchman from Paris wouldn't stop. He looked at me with a sly grin and asked, "And Hitler, does he actually play sports?" The last thing I could have expected such a question. We had an idea of the Führer in a variety of situations. Every day, every newspaper published at least one picture of Hitler and beat into the readers' heads. Hitler can do everything. Hitler knows everything. Hitler sees everything. Hitler is omnipresent. His portrait hung in every room. His bust stood in every corner, and every city had a square and a street bearing his name. We saw pictures. Hitler with children, Hitler with his sheepdog, Hitler with generals, Hitler with diplomats. But Hitler the athlete. I have never heard anything about that, never read anything about that, never seen anything like that. Fortunately, gentlemen, I really can't tell you anything about it. I know nothing about it. The Frenchman laughed. He is, however, an authoritative expert on sports. For example, Hitler spoke about boxing. He said that no sport develops the offensive spirit to such an extent, and he not only said it, he wrote about it. Right here, monsieur, you can read it. The Frenchman took out a pocket edition of Mein Kampf, opened it, and showed me the appropriate place. I suppose every German has read this book, haven't you? Here I laughed. Of course, there are few Germans who do not have this book in their bookcase, but who has actually read it, much less studied it? I, at any rate, have not. The Frenchman was amused that he could thrust under my nose such passages in the book as particularly occupied him. For example, in the chapter on the state, it said, "The popular state sees the ideal of man in the irresistible embodiment of male strength, and in women who bring men back into the world." That's what it said. Women, or another place. To what extent confidence in physical strength awakens courage and even develops offensive spirit can best be judged from the experience of the army. For those manifestations of the immortal offensive spirit and the will to attack, which were inherent in the months of summer and autumn 1914, rapidly advancing German armies were the result of that relentless education. It is the German people who must revive in themselves the belief in the invincibility of their nationality, for that which once led the army to victory. What kind of victory was being talked about was not definitely stated. Probably Hitler was alluding not to the First World War after all. We lost it, but to the War of 1870–1871. It offended the old Frenchman. He turned 2 pages. It said a young man must learn to be silent and, if necessary, to suffer injustice in silence. If German youth had been taught less knowledge and more self-control in the public schools, it would have been richly rewarded in the years 1915–1918. Don't you also find, monsieur, that Hitler writes too much about attack, about victory and about correcting mistakes? I don't like it, I must tell you. I find it sounds like a call for revenge. Are you still convinced there will never be another war? I again favoured of the Frenchman. I again found no answer, and I was angry that he had taught me a lesson. I thought Sir Mitchman is against Hitler. He spoke quite frankly, and his compatriots certainly hold the same opinion. And then a thought occurred to me. How many Frenchmen participated in the Olympics? I asked. I can tell you, monsieur, that there were 127 athletes and 104 attendants. Excellent. So there were more than 300, or, to be exact, 331 Frenchmen at the Olympiad. Were you gentlemen there when the French team walked past the stands? Yes, of course. It was a solemn moment. That's when our national anthem was played. Well, then you probably saw the whole French team marching, greeting Hitler with the German salute, the raising of the right hand. Right? Now I got the old man. The score is 1-1. The French looked at each other, and this time they couldn't find anything to say to me. No one demanded that Hitler be saluted with a show of hands. All the other national teams, except the Italians, did not. Why then did the French do so, if they were against Hitler? But the old Frenchman only grinned and said, "Monsieur, we French are polite people. It was just a gesture, nothing more. Just an ordinary gesture, you know. And tomorrow the whole world will be ours." In the Chancellery of the 14th Company, the order for my transfer to the newly formed 32nd Anti-Tank Company was already on the table. This was the 4th transfer in a relatively short period of time, and again I remained in the same town, proof that not only the number of garrisons was growing, but also their size. I was due to report to the unit on 1 October, and on 2 October the cadre lined up, The recruits did not arrive until 2 days later, and the commander, Oberleutnant Werner E. Renfuscht, made a speech. At the end, medals were handed out for 4 and 12 years of loyal service in the Reichswehr and the Wehrmacht, respectively. We were extremely proud, and the same day we washed our awards. Shortly afterwards, just on my birthday, I received a letter from the Imperial Office for Racial Affairs informing me that in accordance with paragraph so-and-so of the law of such and such a date, I was allowed to remain a soldier. The letter concluded by saying, "This certificate of fitness is for a personnel file and is not a formal certificate of origin. So not everything is in order, but there is no objection." Obviously, the favourable decision for me was due to the fact that after my report about the lack of the document, they measured my skull and photographed me from all sides. Henceforth, I was not promoted until I had received the certificate of Aryan origin. Probably the 3 days on the lip also played a part. But I am convinced that I would have had to pack my bags if I had not received the certificate of Aryan competence issued by the appropriate service authority of Himmler's security units. The courses resumed. First, I went to a course for candidates for platoon commanders in Binsdorf. There they took us so firmly and gave us so much written work that we had no desire to go to Berlin in the evening. Enrollment in the next course took me to the Putler's tank range in Schleswig-Holstein. We were trained in tank unit interaction and anti-tank defense. We had training companies at our disposal for this purpose, and we cadets were assigned as platoon commanders. In 1937, as commander of a half platoon with 2 guns, I took part in the big autumn manoeuvres in Mecklenburg, which were attended by Mussolini. One evening we left Kohlberg for Stettin, and from there we travelled along the recently completed motorway towards Berlin. However, following the order given, our formations turned west and northwest at the places indicated, and it was not yet dawn when all the units of our division fled into the Mecklenburg forests. My humble task was to defend the road against possible tank breakthroughs. It led from the village where some headquarters were stationed, first through a forest inaccessible to tanks, then went upwards and finally crossed the battlefield. If the tanks wanted to penetrate the village, since there was a forest in the way, they would have to advance in column along the road. Thus, the only correct position for my guns was a slight bend in the road in the woods, where I could shoot the tanks without fear of being detected. The first tank's hit would have blocked the road for the whole column. Only the observation point would have to be located ahead on a hill. From the forest it was impossible to see the picture of the unfolding manoeuvres, while from the observation post the whole terrain could be seen. I was familiar with the situation and knew that the program did not envisage tanks advancing in this direction at all. Therefore, I moved both guns to the hillside so that the gun crew could observe the situation. In combat conditions, we would be destroyed by artillery, and in case of a tank attack, we would be easily wiped off the face of the earth. Suddenly, I noticed that large all-terrain vehicles were rushing along the road, and ahead of them, a good dozen motorcyclists without sidecars. Through binoculars, I could already see the Standartenführer. Bloody hell! I had never thought that such a column would be heading down this road, which also led away from the battlefield. I still had hope that Hitler would rush past, but he ordered me to stop. According to the situation, the calculations had to remain at the guns, while I ran to the car and reported, naming my unit and reporting on the received task. Hitler raised his hand for his typical salute, with the hand slightly bent back, then stood up and looked around the area. Suddenly he grinned. His adjutants and accompanying generals did the same. Then I heard him say, "Excellent position. Visibility to the horizon. No one can pass through here." And again, addressing either the generals or us, he said, "Very well chosen. A splendid position." The generals nodded approvingly. I was disappointed, for my Führer did not extend his hand to me, as it was depicted in the photographs I had seen. Nevertheless, I could see him at a distance of 1 meter. For a long time I stared after the column, which was moving away in a cloud of dust. We were still discussing the unexpected incident when suddenly a car approached again, this time only the company commander's car. What happened here? I reported on the Führer's visit to our position. How did you end up in such a ridiculous position? I honestly reported what induced me to climb the hill with the guns and the staff. So you wanted to see the countryside. You don't know that you and your soldiers are not spectators in a theatre. You have to do your job, and you have to do it exactly as you are trained to do it. Everything was clear to me, but I said, not to justify myself, that the Führer was delighted with the choice of position. The commander looked at me, and, to my relief, I noticed the wrinkles scattering from the corners of his eyes and his face taking on a laughing expression for a moment. Then he became serious again and said without looking at me, "In fact, I ought to cut you to pieces. Get out of here and into the forest at once. You monkeys." If he swore or used not too refined expressions, he was in a good mood. But when he was seriously angry, he spoke very quietly, very decorously and emphatically. Unfortunately, this company commander was soon transferred to another unit. Parting, he presented me with a silver dark bow. The regimental commander agreed to his offer, and I was promoted to field fable, despite the fact that I had made the mistake of taking a splendid position on a hill. A few months later, there was again occasion for the same kind of discussion that took place when Schleicher was shot. On 4 February 1938, the newspapers reported that Minister of War von Blomberg and Colonel General Baron von Fritsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, had been removed from their posts. The minister because he had married a prostitute, and the Commander-in-Chief because of his homosexual tendencies. Readers were clearly led to believe that the Führer did not consider either rank or office when it was necessary to take care of the purity of morals. The press wrote nothing about the real reasons for these repressions. Blomberg was, after all, the first general to be promoted to field marshal after 1918. His dishonourable wedding was attended by the highest representatives of the Nazi Party and the generals, while Fritzsch's alleged homosexual partner was eventually revealed to have been a subject bribed by Himmler to do his bidding. Fritsch had to be rehabilitated, retained the right to wear the uniform, and became honorary chief of the artillery regiment of the Schwerin division. In my Kohlberg entourage, it was felt that the removal of both generals, who held the highest positions, constituted an insult to the Wehrmacht and caused some excitement. Various questions were asked, but something quite different soon took place. On 12 February 1938, Hitler met at Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden with Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg, and exactly 1 month later Wehrmacht units entered Vienna. The country that had been Hitler's homeland became one part of the great German Empire. The masses cheered and shouted, "One nation, one Reich, one Führer." We spoke no more of Blomberg and Fritzsch, especially since the Wehrmacht obviously meant something, and just 6 months later Hitler emphasized this particularly at the Nuremberg Party Congress of 1938, when he called the Wehrmacht the military backbone of and declared that the Wehrmacht and the party were the two main pillars of the National Socialist state. These words caused a new surge of pride. It became clear that great importance was attached to the Wehrmacht. New ranks were handed out quite generously, although the measure could not be the career of Göring, who ended the First World War in the rank of captain, and then immediately found himself in the rank of Colonel General as Commander-in-Chief of the Nazi Air Force. In any case, it happened more and more often that a young trainee for the rank of officer was fast-tracked to lieutenant, and the sons of large landowners proudly walked around with the rank of reserve officer after short-term training. I had to supervise some of the reserve officer courses. There were some of them who took their service very seriously. But there were also many who, taking advantage of favourable conditions, accelerated their promotion either by drinking at the officers' casino or by inviting regular officers to go hunting. Among the short-term trained lieutenants, I met real sportsmen. They did not shy away from difficulties. But there were also a lot of careerists who kept very modestly during the training hours, but later revealed their true colours. It was not difficult to expose them at the first suitable occasion. On this point we had a complete unanimity with the soldiers. I must not fail to mention a special specimen, a young lieutenant. This type once had the idea to make his Dachshund a sergeant and put the corresponding insignia round his neck during exercises. When the soldiers were rushing across the yard or crawling across it on all fours, the lieutenant played with his effriator, driving the soldiers. After a while the dog was already running adorned with the galloons of a non-commissioned officer. No officer objected. One morning, shortly before rising, a tremendous scandal broke out in the barracks of our company. The noise came from the flat of a lieutenant who owned a Dachshund. The beautiful Lola, as she was called in the garrison, had spent the night at his apartment. Apparently, in her sweet awakening, she had let down her pretty foot from the bed, and this was not to the Dachshund's liking. At any rate, she grasped the leg with her teeth, and hard, for she had the rank of non-commissioned officer. Lola shrieked loudly, and the lieutenant tried to calm her down. But Lola must have thought it was a rare opportunity to raise her profile. She didn't stop until the lieutenant, at a loss, called a medical officer, who gave Lola a tetanus shot and bandaged her leg. The same day, the whole garrison learnt of the incident. For her blunder, the Dachshund was demoted to private and from that day onwards wore the usual collar again. On Wehrmacht Day, during a parade, the Dachshund was hit by a car. The lieutenant ordered her to be buried behind the barracks. On this occasion, 4 soldiers were ordered to fire 3 volleys of blank cartridges. This was too much for the company commander, who had previously been patient. The lieutenant was reprimanded. Again, new recruits arrived. They had already served their time in labour camps, and moreover in the Rhineland, in the construction of the Western Defence Line. Along the western border, using natural obstacles, they built a system of long-term defences for guns of all calibres, including concreted machine gun emplacements and a long line of anti-tank barriers in front of the dugouts. The Western Defence Belt was to be something similar to the Maginot Line, which the French had erected after the First World War. This construction was heralded as a sure sign that Hitler had no intention of launching an offensive in the West, so claimed the workers from the labour conscription units, who told of the enormous amounts of steel and concrete used in the construction, of excavators digging into the ground and concrete mixers rumbling. In the East, we had almost every week battle alarms, but not just the usual masquerade, when soldiers had to hastily line up to get back into bed. Such drills were done by the squad leaders. No, it was a real war drill. The company had to report to the vehicles in full dress, and the units moved out of the barracks. Personal belongings, civilian suits, photo albums, books and everything else had to be put into a cardboard box, with a home address written on it and handed over to the clothing store, just as if the soldiers were going to war. Sometimes we were back in an hour, sometimes the exercise lasted 2 days. The main thing was to practice the movement of colonies, dispersal in the event of an air attack. There were many opportunities for this. Just 5 kilometers away from the Pasha barracks in Bodenhagen, by order of Göring on swampy ground, which required a huge expenditure, was built a large air base for the bomber squadron Hindenburg. There were day and night training single and group flights. Thus, we did not have to invent the appearance of enemy planes to drive the company into safe cover. Nearby was a training ground for anti-aircraft artillery, from which firing was done at naval targets or at targets towed by aircraft. Deafening noise and alarms sounded almost continuously. But noisy and disturbing was also the information about the events taking place. After Austria was absorbed into the German Reich, the leader of the fascist party in Czechoslovakia, Konrad Henlein, began to prepare the annexation of the German Sudeten lands to Germany. Not a day went by that the press and radio did not report about arbitrariness, oppression, and acts of violence against the German population in Czechoslovakia. I took all these reports at face value and was far from thinking that this was a way of stirring up the people so that the Hitler government could use it for the purpose of taking over Czechoslovakia. Every newsreel showed the Western Defence Line bristling with formidable cannon emplacements and anti-tank barriers. Every opportunity was used by Hitler, Goebbels, or other Nazi leaders to declare that the patience of the German people was not unlimited. On the night of 1 October 1938, we were again alerted. Everything was packed and loaded, but this time we did not drive out of the gate. The vehicles and guns were standing ready to move out. The guards were dispersed, but the commander ordered the company to assemble in a large room for training. Soon the Gehauptfeldwebel, a military rank recently introduced, as well as the ranks of Oberfeldwebel and Stafffeldwebel, reported that the company was assembled. Impatiently, we waited to see what our commander would say. He was very serious when informed about the situation. As you know, the British Prime Minister Chamberlain, 16 September, met with the Fuhrer in Bad Godesberg. He then flew back to London. On 22 September, a new conversation took place in Berchtesgaden. After the Hauptfeldwebel coughed, and prompting, "Sorry, Herr Captain, the other way round. First to Baden and then Godesberg." Of course. However, it is not so important. So, after the negotiations in Berchtesgaden and Godesberg, a conference was held in Munich on the 29th of September, at which the Führer, the Deuce, Mr. Chamberlain from England and Mr. Daladier from France finally came to an agreement. The question of the Sudetenland is settled. It goes to Germany. Wehrmacht units have already entered it. jubilant cheers accompanied the captain's speech. Everyone gave vent to their enthusiasm. Only the young pastor, who was serving his military term, raised his hand to ask a question. Mr. Captain, was no one from the Czech side present at the conference? As far as I am informed, the Czech government has been informed of the decision of the four powers and has given its consent to the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany. Throwing a glance out the window at the barracks yard where transport vehicles and guns were parked, the commander continued his speech. We are armed for any situation. Together with 8 Austrian divisions, we now have 51 divisions of ground troops. That's almost 1 million soldiers. To this we must add the Air Force with several thousand machines and more than 300,000 men. And then the Navy, a total of 1.5 million rounded up, under arms and on alert. In addition, since 1935 there has been universal conscription, which in 1936 was extended to 2 more conscription ages. We have thus trained a large number of reserve soldiers who can be called up at any time. In case of war, we can field several millions. This is known abroad as well. However, the four powers accepted at Munich an undertaking to ensure the inviolability of the remaining part of Czechoslovakia if the Czechs now behave sensibly. We were already familiar with such formulations from the usual company training sessions, in which those who were detached from the company for various duties also took part. We had to be constantly convinced of what progress had been made since 1933. The company commander paused and looked round the rows of soldiers sitting before him, as if he was expecting a new response to his long speech. The company field officer was about to step forward, but the captain stopped him with a sign and continued. When you imagine everything that has happened in recent years, you cannot help but feel a sense of pride. Not so long ago we were trampling on the place with 100,000 soldiers and no one considered us. Now we are among the great powers and guarantee the existence of other states on the basis of a treaty such as this Munich Treaty. English, French and Italian statesmen come to us at Hitler's summons. I will honestly tell you that 4 years ago I would have considered this impossible. Munich is a great success for our diplomacy. But without us soldiers, diplomacy is unthinkable. Thus, Germany gets the living space it needs and peace will be preserved. And now, Hauptfeldführer, give me the file. The captain announced new promotions. Many soldiers were promoted to effrients, 4 to non-commissioned officers, 1 became a non-commissioned field fable, and 1 became a field fable. All this was not a surprise to me. As platoon commander, I had to present the characteristics and participated in the last decisive discussion of the candidates. So I was looking around with some boredom when suddenly a neighbour pushed me. The commander called my name. I jumped up. Mr. Captain? No, come forward. Was he going to reprimand me in front of the whole company for dozing off? I waited tensely to see what the captain would say. I present you with a certificate of your appointment. You have been promoted to Oberfeldwebel, said the captain. Best wishes. Then he pinned me a 2nd star and a new epaulette. In the meantime, the Hauptfeldwebel took care of the others, whispering in my ear. This must be celebrated. Although the company was on alert, the commander allowed a small feast. Together with the non-commissioned officers who had just been produced, we went to the Soldiers' Club. The company was still indoors for classes. As we walked across the courtyard, there was rattling from the open window. We will move on to the march. Let everything be blown to pieces. Today we own Germany. Tomorrow the whole world will be ours. We feasted on the stars and stripes, the capture of the Sudetenland and the Munich Agreement. The Jagerland March was played on the radio every half hour. The entry of the Wehrmacht into the new imperial regions was done according to schedule. As an Oberfeldwebel, I received a large salary and could afford to go to Berlin for a few days at the end of the week to celebrate my 2nd star with my family again. At every crossroads and on every underground train, I put a few small coins into the numerous collection cups. The 1-course lunch that was served in all the houses on a certain Sunday each month was a regular occurrence for me in the barracks. But I did not realize that in this way it was obligatory to save money for new contributions to the treasury. In the evening, the whole family was assembled. We talked about our nice relatives, chatted about politics. After Munich, my parents had given up hoping for the return of the Kaiser or the other Hohenzollerns. My mother was filled with gratitude to the Führer for ensuring peace, and she held his way of life, or rather what was told about it, up to us as an example. You must imitate him. The Führer does not smoke, does not drink. He is a vegetarian and leads a very decent life. My brother, the propaganda official, intervened. You mean he's not interested in women? Goebbels does it all the harder. Do you know what nickname they gave him? The Goat of Babelsberg, because he only promotes actresses who've been in his bed. There have already been many big scandals because of this, and you wouldn't believe me at all if I told you how much money the parties on Schwanenwerder Elern cost. He did not wish to reveal any more secrets, for he had sworn an oath, after all. I wanted to know more about the work of the Ministry of Propaganda. Whoever was there could give me a rough indication of what we could expect in politics in the near future, but my brother was silent. But the Crown Prince put out his thought. Hey, I have nothing against Goebbels. At least he has achieved something and does not make a fuss about his person. But look at the other one. Goering puts on a new uniform every day and adorns himself with a new order. Chief of Staff of the Stormtroopers, Lutz has a huge villa and will not even look at the ordinary stormtrooper. Ribbentrop spreads his tail like a peacock, and if Himmler shows himself anywhere, the street is patrolled by armed squads, as in a real uprising. Since Adolf was the first to dig with a shovel in the construction of a motorway, he is no longer seen among the workers. The only exception is Robert Lee, who occasionally walks round the works. But even that one is drunk most of the time. If the father had not interrupted the Crown Prince, he would probably have characterized the entire Nazi leadership in the same spirit. Now the father has spoken. All this is true, boys, but in one respect they did the right thing. The administration and bureaucracy remained in place. There were some changes at the top, but they kept the whole apparatus. They didn't dare approach us, and that's for the best. Now at least the office is functioning properly. But Willy immediately object. They kept the others. Look who Adolf and Göring are always sitting together with. The gentlemen from big industry, the moneybags, the old bankers we used to oppose. They know how to make money out of everything. Before 1933, we called them plutocrats, speculators and exploiters. Now they get party badges of honor. You won't see other people in the Führer's entourage anymore. After a short pause, the Crown Prince turned to me. You live there in Coburg, together with your soldiers, as on the moon. You see and hear nothing. You should live here and see what is played out here every day. If we're doing well, it's because we have a strong Wehrmacht. That's clear, isn't it? Who's bragging? Since the annexation of Austria, and especially now, after the Munich Agreement, the members of the NSDAP have become unrecognizable, full of conceit and arrogance. I tell you, as if it were their own merit, everywhere you encounter such arrogance. It is simply disgusting. We've got to the point where foreigners are being insulted in our streets. That's how they criticized the Nazi bosses all evening. Nevertheless, our whole family held National Socialist views. Somewhat disheartened, I returned to the garrison. In listing the top Nazi bosses, my brother did not have time to characterize Gauleiter Julius Streicher. Streicher published the magazine Stürmer, which from the first to the last page printed the most incredible nonsense about the Jews. Their religious and cultural customs were trampled into the mud. It was alleged that the Jews were plotting a worldwide conspiracy against Germany. On 7 November 1938, a young Jew, Herschel Grinspan, shot and killed Ernst von Rath, a member of the German embassy in Paris. The killing was a desperate protest against the oppression in Germany of the murderer's family and co-religionists, and against the persecution in Germany of all dissenters. The case was within the jurisdiction of the French police and court, but the masters of Germany at the time felt that what had happened was a welcome excuse to launch a long-planned action against the Jews. The blacks in brown and black uniforms were given the will for one night, but those hours between 9 and 10 November became an indelible stain on our history, a shameful chapter that bears the name Crystal Night. Almost all synagogues were burned. Jewish shops were emptied and destroyed. Jewish flats were looted and damaged. Jews were beaten and taken to prisons by the thousands. The official German press portrayed the events as if they were a manifestation of popular anger, against which the police and fire brigades were supposedly powerless. That evening I went to a cafe in Coburg with a few friends and acquaintances. Then we went to the cinema, and finally we went to 4 or 5 restaurants. We saw no trace of popular anger. 4 months later, Hitler trampled on the Munich Agreement. After Slovakia had been separated from the Czechoslovak Republic with his help, he forced Czech President Gacsa, using threats to conclude a protectorate treaty. The state whose inviolability had been guaranteed only 6 months earlier by Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain and Daladier became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. On 15 March 1939, the Wehrmacht invaded Prague. The newspapers assured that Czechoslovakia as a separate state was unviable. Moreover, it was wedged into German territory, and Prague, they said, was an old German city, and now it was German again. The guarantor powers in Rome, Paris and London have taken note of all this. No one asked what the people of Czechoslovakia thought about it. And according to the weekly newsreels, it looked as if the people of Prague were rejoicing no less than the people of Vienna had done the year before. 2 groups formed among the officers of our unit. To one belonged Lieutenant Colonel Berner Efrucht, our regimental commander, Captain Fehlhagen, the company commander, and Oberleutnant Schneider, a very popular officer. They were joined by Major Waldstein, chief of the military recruiting station, a frequent visitor to the ploughmen's detachment. These officers, with the greatest caution, unequivocally for those who wished to understand, expressed the opinion that Hitler had not acted quite rightly in this case, and now, surely, something must happen. The other group, to which mainly the young officers belonged, was full of enthusiasm. Hitler had done the right thing. He had acted with lightning speed and had confronted other governments with a fait accompli. This was the only way to achieve anything. This was a view I fully shared at the time. As at the capture of the Sudetenland, the order for combat readiness was given and, as then, it was later cancelled. One of the gun commanders exclaimed disappointed, "What wild nonsense! Only a combat alert again. Others are lucky. We were not involved in the case neither in the Rhineland, nor in Austria, nor in the Sudetenland, and now too." I shrugged my shoulders. What could I say? I would willingly have been in Prague myself. My contact, who was standing nearby, glanced at me and pronounced, "The others are lucky. We here, by the Baltic Sea, are too far away from the hot zone." On 20 April 1939, the German Reich celebrated Adolf Hitler's birthday. After the parade, everyone was free from duty. But when the command disperse was given, I was called up by the company commander. "The regimental commander has ordered you to take part in the festivities at the officers' casino. Dress uniform, white shirt, understand?" "Yes, sir, Captain." "Besides you, there are several other field officers invited, so you shouldn't be embarrassed. The start time is exactly at 19. You won't have to pay, understand?" Soon the evening came. The casino, to which the tennis court adjoined, was outside the barracks, not far from the sea. In the dining hall we took our seats according to rank. The regimental commander, company commanders, oberleutnants, and among the Oberfenriches and Fenrichs, us, the field fleebles who were allowed to attend the feast. The regimental commander tapped his glass, as is proper, to begin his speech. It must have been difficult for him. I've already said that he belonged to the group that was concerned about how Hitler's foreign policy escapades would not cause a dangerous reaction abroad for Germany. Again, the situation was tense, and not quite clear, but anxious fuss began around the Polish corridor and the free city of Danzig. However, it had not yet come to shooting. But despite all his doubts, Lieutenant Colonel Werner Ehrenfuchs made a speech which hardly differed in any way from the speeches made at the same hour in all the other officers' casinos of the Wehrmacht. And in conclusion, "Gentlemen, I ask..." There followed the noise of the chairs being pulled out, the position at attention, the glasses at the level of the third button from the top, and the "Gentlemen, in honor of the Führer, Sieg Heil." Sieg Heil. After the official part, the society split into groups. The doors to the club rooms were opened. The ladies were not present. 3 soldiers played a march and music was... Many things were ordered, not only music. After the regimental commander and Major Waldstein left, the festivities turned into a wild binge. I sat at the same table with Oberleutnant Schneider, 3 young lieutenants and 1 Oberfenrich. The little lieutenant kept particularly boisterous. The commander said all the right things, but he chickened out, I tell you. He just chickened out. Oberleutnant Schneider stopped him. "Oh, leave the commander alone. It's not appropriate here." "Of course, Herr Oberleutnant, it's not appropriate here." "Excuse me, Herr Oberleutnant." A little later he returned to the same subject. Nothing else occurred to him. The commander was afraid that the Czechs, French and English would shoot. They're all cowardly dogs, I tell you. They don't even think about it. And yet the commander— One of the lieutenants interrupted him. No, shut up. What will the orderlies think? What? The orderlies? They're not supposed to think. They're only supposed to serve. Ordinaries. Hey, ordinarettes, another bottle of champagne. Hurry up. The bottle of champagne soon turned into a bottle, and then another and another. No, gentlemen, it was clear to me that the Kakseks wouldn't make a peep. The Führer knows better than the commander. Do you know what's next? Poland, gentlemen, Poland, one by one, down with the corridor, give up Danzig. It's clear. At a neighbouring table, the word Poland was picked up, and immediately they sang a song about beautiful girls in a Polish town. One of the lieutenants at our table was singing along quietly. Then he looked at us and said in a mysterious whisper, "There are women in Poland, gentlemen, of the highest class. Pedigree women." The lieutenant, who had just been talking persistently about the commander, hit the table with his fist. "What is that you said just now? Thoroughbred women? They're filthy, that's what. In our estate we had reapers who came from Poland living in barracks. We're going to civilize them at last. And he says thoroughbred women, he's crazy. Ordinarettes, another bottle." The lieutenant was preoccupied with the Poles, but he must have forgotten about the commander. Suddenly he returned to the siege subject, but then Oberlieutenant Schneider intervened. "Stop it at last. The Czechs had no leadership. That's our good fortune. Their government was completely bankrupt, otherwise things would have turned out differently, you can be sure. And that's enough of that." He said all this quite calmly, but quite firmly. No one coming to our table now would have thought that the Oberlieutenant had drunk exactly the same number of glasses as the rest of us. But the lieutenant did not relent. He stood up, staggering from side to side, and, waving his right hand in the direction of Oberlieutenant Schneider, shouted, "We would defeat the Czechs. And we would smash the Poles to smithereens, too. I was there when the Führer said to us, 'You, my young men, must be as agile as greyhounds, as tough as leather, and as hard as Krupp steel.' Yes, that's what the Führer told us, and that's what we are, Herr Oberlieutenant." Here he bent threefold and fell back in his chair with his legs stretched out. Schneider summoned the orderly and ordered, "Bring me, please, a cup of mocha and a shot of brandy to that table over there. Yes, please." Then he got up from his seat, nodded to us, and walked away without even glancing at the lieutenant. And the latter raised his head. Ordinarettes. 3 more bottles of champagne, and turn round faster than before. This unpleasant episode went unnoticed in the general noise. In another corner by the fireplace, some Oberfenrich stood on a table and sang. A lieutenant from the Hitler Youth suddenly disappeared and never appeared again. We eventually found him in the lavatory. It was filthy from top to bottom. We put him on a chair and locked the door. He fell asleep and never bothered us again. The feast continued in the great hall. No one remembered what the feast was about. Glasses were thrown against the wall, shards flew to the floor, the contents of ashtrays were scattered on the carpets, and the tablecloths with spilled red wine looked like a geographical map. As dawn broke, we began to gradually disperse. The cloakroom was a terrible mess. Somebody wore someone else's overcoat, somebody had mixed up their caps. A Fenrich pulled his soiled hand out of a pocket in which someone had put mustard. Another poured beer into his cap, and, to everyone's amusement, put it on his head. Someone demanded a cold pilsner, and everyone shout, "To our protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Cheers, gentlemen, cheers." There was a little lieutenant in the lavatory. He was banging on the door and growling. Stern as Krupp steel, unyielding as a piece of leather, agile as greyhounds. Ordinarettes, my cap and my sabre. On the 1st of September, the war against Poland began. Already before, it was easy to see that preparations for war were underway. Most of us, however, assumed that events would take the turn we were already familiar with. First a broad campaign in the press and on the radio, then sharp diplomatic notes, then brazen threats, and finally the Wehrmacht invaded Poland. In the weeks preceding the outbreak of war, I stayed in Kolberg. It was clear that some events were coming because the reservists who had completed their service had been called up. All the barracks were crowded. Even the attics and gymnasiums were set up with camp bunks. 2 and 3 at a time, one above the other. The reservists spent 2 days practicing the salute, the parade step, and the equal in formation. 2 days learning to crawl on all fours and crawl, and the last 2 days of the week we marched frantically with them in the field. On Sunday they cleaned the rooms, lavatories and corridors, and in the evening they went to the soldiers' club and became old servants again. One morning the company field sergeant appeared in front of the formation with a very serious expression on his face. He held under his arm a red binder with a wide yellow stripe on the diagonal, a Secret Service document of the command. It was the so-called mobilization deployment calendar, and we were read the names of the soldiers and non-commissioned officers who were to form the new unit of the active army. It consisted of about 1/3 cadres, 1/3 reservists, and 1/3 young soldiers. It was envisaged that they would be transferred to the Polish border. The rest, to which I belonged, were to remain in the garrison and train the new reservists. I was extremely disappointed. My platoon was taken over by a reserve lieutenant, a teacher or a bank clerk with a pretense of an army uniform. That alone annoyed me, but the biggest annoyance was that I had to stay home again. I had not taken part in the occupation of the Rhineland, nor had I been to Austria and Czechoslovakia, and now when, as I thought, the last manoeuvre had been undertaken, and when something more serious might happen, and I might have to fight when, therefore, I could really show my soldierly qualities, just now I had to stay again. I outlined my complaint on this point to the company commander. He ridiculed me. Firstly, I am a soldier and I have to obey orders. Secondly, I need good platoon commanders to man the full reserve units. Thirdly, I am in the reserve, a candidate for officer rank, and Poland is likely to lose officers. Thus, I still have a long way to go. My superior was right. I was then firmly convinced that I had to give up the last opportunity to take part in the cause and to receive the order which the legionaries had brought home from Spain, or the Iron Cross, which had been worn by our fathers and which Hitler had re-established in anticipation of war. But before escorting me out, the commander made a fourth argument. Besides, I have a special task for you, and I hope you will fulfill it well. Contact Major Waldstein at once. You'll hear the rest from him. As already mentioned, Major Waldstein was the head of the military recruiting center. He was a quiet elderly officer with a wide scar on his chin, a memorable mark he had received in the First World War. After a short explanation, he handed me a red folder with a yellow stripe down the diagonal, a Secret Service document of the command. It was a mobilization deployment plan for 3 transport companies. The place of formation, Restaurant Schützenhaus in Kohlberg, apart from a red folder, a large dance hall in the Schützenhaus, and a few tables and chairs. I had nothing else, at least nothing from which to create a transport company. The situation changed abruptly the next morning. The fact was that a few days earlier summonses had been sent out to report to the recruiting station, and so men, mostly veterans of the First World War, rolled in from all sides. Every second man arrived in a lorry his own or his company's, but the means of transport had been secretly pre-inspected and registered. I only had to tick the name of the arriving reservist in the mobilization deployment plan, and an expert commission determined the condition of the vehicle, which was bought or rented. The soldiers received pistols or carbines, uniforms, and started formation exercises. The 3 transport companies were prepared. Thus ended the first day. On the second day, all the vehicles were speedily painted in the usual army camouflage colors and filled with fuel. The men received dry rations, ammunition, and individual packets, which we had almost forgotten, but the military recruiting station had provided for every last detail. There were also protective capes and Lozantin tablets in case of chemical warfare. On the third day, we worked out with 3 transport companies the movement of the column on the march, stops for technical reasons, dispersal, and shelter during an air attack. On the 4th day, the vehicles moved towards the Polish border. Just of how eagerly I would have travelled with them. It is true that since the First World War there had been some unpleasant notions associated with transport, and we, young soldiers, did not consider transport and logistics soldiers to be fully fledged soldiers. Nevertheless, I would have preferred to go on a campaign in Poland instead of with this company than to train recruits again at home. None of us realized how mistaken our attitude towards the soldiers of the transport and supply units had been. Many would later prefer to lie on the front line in a trench, in a shelter, and would not swap with a driver who had to deliver ammunition or food through a partisan area under artillery fire. We also looked down on the clerks at the military recruiting office and called them contemptuously ink scribblers. But now that I had experienced the mobilization plan firsthand, After I got an idea of the work at the recruiting office and had seen how smoothly everything went, I began to feel respect for the work of this apparatus. I felt respect even for the red folder with a yellow stripe on the diagonal, for every secret official document of the command. For just as I had manned 3 companies practically on an empty place, many hundreds of new units were being formed in all the garrisons. It did not occur to me that this whole mechanism, which I admired, served the sole purpose of enslaving neighbouring states. I no longer remembered that I had previously considered it a sign of special loyalty that the Reichswehr here, under the new leadership, had stayed out of the way. After all, the mobilization was the result of planning in Bendestrasse, planning in the former ministry of the Reichswehr. There, everything that was carried out on an even larger scale after 1933 was thoroughly prepared. After the special assignment with which the commander tried to console me, I busied myself with his other assignments. Days went by day after day. New recruits and new reservists were arriving. In a short time the reservists became regular soldiers, but we old soldiers were not satisfied. The training did not correspond to our concepts. Everything was done hastily. The numerical strength of the Wehrmacht was impressive. It was superbly armed, but with numbers and armament had to be combined with solid training, which in my opinion at the time was impossible in such a feverish rush. I did not then consider the merits or demerits of our methods of drill. I was annoyed by the fact that the soldiers no longer salute so youthfully, not so accurately execute the command round march, and not so quickly crawl on all fours across the open ground as we had been trained to do. My company duties still included instruction at the reserve officers' course. Von Sitzwitz, von Platen and von Puttkammer were there. They wished to follow the example of their glorious ancestors, although they no longer rode on horseback, but travelled in an officer's all-terrain vehicle, arrogant and arrogant. These gentlemen had little interest in the routine service which is inevitable in technical troops. They wanted to command, for that was what they believed they were born to do, and like their ancestors, they diligently consumed champagne. There was not an evening that passed without a feast in the officers' casino, and there were no mornings in which the gentlemen did not endeavour to sleep. Frankly speaking, it gave me great pleasure to keep them awake. On 1 September there was Himmler's staged Polish attack on the radio station at Gliwice, and Hitler wailed over the radio. From this morning we will open fire. Years of noisy Goebbels propaganda had made the German attack on Poland quite popular with the public and the Wehrmacht. Now, at last, the legitimate German claims to the Polish corridor and the free city of Danzig were to be realized. Thus bellicose sentiments were increasingly fueled. They reached their highest point in the last weeks before the attack. In addition, Hitler decided to make a foreign policy tactical move. In June 1939, between Berlin and Rome, was concluded a treaty under which Germany ceded Italy's South Tyrol. At the same time, 250,000 South Tyrolean inhabitants were invited to choose, reach citizenship, and register for resettlement in Germany. Hence, this time it was possible to get home to the Reich at the cost of giving up their former residence. Few in Germany sympathized with the idea. In Austria, many were embittered, and the Tyrolese felt they had been sold out. But Goebbels used the occasion to use this example to rant about the Führer's fairness, his willingness to compromise and his desire for agreement. I was not the only one to be won over by his arguments. The one who makes concessions in the name of peace has the right to seek from the other side to fulfill his legitimate demands, especially since these were the last demands that Hitler intended to put forward, as he himself had assured. Accordingly, I considered the war just and the resistance of the Poles pointless. The story of Czechoslovakia was again pushed into the background. We waited impatiently for news of victories and rejoiced at every success of the Wehrmacht. As the propaganda against Poland intensified, the anti-Soviet propaganda weakened. Suddenly we had to read and hear not only moderate, but sometimes even favourable reports about the Soviet Union and its government. Nevertheless, we looked around in confusion when the radio and newspapers announced that a non-aggression pact had been signed in Moscow between Germany and the Soviet Union. Still, Goebbels managed to make the pact popular with the help of whisper propaganda. In the end, we recognized it as simply brilliant to enter into an alliance with a great power in the East. For such a policy was reminiscent of Bismarck's attitude towards Russia. The conclusion of the pact was preceded by repeated efforts by the Soviet government to reach an agreement with the Polish government. The Soviet Union would have undertaken the defense of its Western neighbor, but Warsaw relied on paper guarantees from the British and French. Poland's fate was thus sealed. However, the Soviet Union had to take care to protect itself against an attack by Hitler's Germany. This was the reason for the pact and the agreement on the demarcation line. The war against Poland lasted only 18 days. Hitler's Germany had the opportunity to use a strategic advantage, a favourable geographical position. The Wehrmacht not only attacked from the front along the western border of Poland, but also invaded Polish territory from the south, from Slovakia, and from the north, from East Prussia. All these 18 days we, who remained in the garrison, followed the events with mixed feelings. For all the excitement at the news of the victories, we were tormented by the thought that we were out of action. The inhabitants looked at us sympathetically. After all, many of them had relatives over there, and this finally convinced us that the past had suffered a huge setback, since we are not involved in the great hour of Germany. The Hindenburg bomber squadron made daily sorties from Bodenhagen over Warsaw and other Polish cities, dropped bombs on Polish women and children, and in the evening celebrated their successes in Kolberg. These cleaners, as we contemptuously called them, were now the heroes of the day. They told of the barrage of Polish anti-aircraft guns, told of battles with Polish fighters, and it seemed a miracle that they invariably gathered in the evening in full force. At that time we did not know that the Polish General Staff had failed to modernize the armament of its army in time. Polish fighter planes were obsolete, anti-aircraft artillery was even less in line with the latest level of military technology. Later, soldiers of army units told us about such cases, when Polish cavalry undertook attacks with raised pikes against German tank formations. The Polish cavalrymen were told, even in troop exercises, that the German armament was a bluff, and that a large part of the German tanks were made of cardboard and wood. In these days we had stacks of letters and parcels piling up for the soldiers in Kolberg. In other garrisons, obviously, the same thing was happening. In their haste, they had not given their relatives and friends the number of the field post office. Down, the mail had to be forwarded to a military unit in Poland. We envied the Oberfeldwebel to whom this was assigned. When he returned a few days later, we all surrounded him in a dense crowd and listened breathlessly to his stories. After a long search, he found the right part, unloaded the mail and drove back, but not in an empty wagon. In the storeroom grunted 3 fat pigs for. The kitchen of our acquisition department, and for himself personally he brought a radio and a carpet. Maybe asked in amazement. Tell me, please, is it all so easy to take it all away? Of course. What did you think? You have no idea what kind of ownerless property is lying around and disappearing. It's pathetic. But there must be owners somewhere, Poles. We all kept on inquiring. No. So you could get a radio and a rug without anything. What are you guys talking about? Have you never heard of trophies of war? We home soldiers argued for many days in our garrison about whether or not we could not take trophies. From the story of the Oberfeldwebel, we learnt that there were casualties in our military unit as well. We were told the names of comrades who only a few weeks ago were lying next to us on the beach by the Baltic Sea. A strange feeling enveloped us at the thought that they would never come back. It was not easy for the company commander to inform the next of kin of the dead. They learnt from the letter that their father or son had died a heroic death for the Führer and the nation, had given his life for the glory and majesty of the fatherland. The war with Poland ended quickly. Greater Germany swelled more and more. It absorbed the Polish corridor, Danzig and other areas of Poland and pocketed the Polish lands, all the way to the Bug River in the form of a Governor-General's office, as spoils of war. Hitler hosted a grand parade in Warsaw, and we were drunk in our garrison, believing that a great victory had been won. There was no more talk of modest trophies, pigs, radios and carpets.